June 26, 1944, Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. The checkerboard on the wooden table remained unfinished mid-game when Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald lifted his eyes from the board. Standing at his door was a man who had just introduced himself, but the name hadn't immediately registered. MacDonald was too focused on his match with Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, the operations officer for the 75th Fighter Group, known as Satan's Angels. The civilian repeated his introduction, this time with a quiet, steady confidence that made MacDonald pause. Charles Lindbergh. MacDonald's mind caught up a second later. The Charles Lindbergh, the man who nearly 2 decades earlier had captured the world's imagination by crossing the Atlantic alone in the spirit of St. Louis. The aviation legend himself now stood at his door on a remote military base in the Pacific. Lindbergh wasn't in uniform. Technically, he wasn't even supposed to be there. He was a civilian consultant working for United Aircraft, sent to help improve the efficiency of fighter planes in combat. Yet everyone knew his presence was controversial. Lindbergh's political past, especially his isolationist stance before Pearl Harbor, had tarnished his reputation in Washington. Still, out here in the jungle, he wasn't a politician. He was a pilot, and he was here to fly. MacDonald, slightly stunned, invited him inside. What followed over the next few weeks would become one of the most remarkable and least discussed chapters of Lindbergh's life. Lindbergh had arrived in New Guinea to study engine performance in tropical conditions. But his curiosity and restlessness led him far beyond a clipboard and stopwatch. He began flying with combat squadrons, not just observing, but actively taking part in missions. Though officially restricted to testing, he quietly crossed that line more than once. The first time Lindbergh joined a mission, pilots were uneasy. Here was the man they'd read about as kids, the American hero who had flown non-stop across the Atlantic, now volunteering to squeeze into the cramped cockpit of a P-38 Lightning and head into enemy skies. At 42, Lindbergh was older than most of the men in the air. Yet when the engines roared to life and the Lightning's twin propellers cut through the tropical haze, it was as if time rolled back. He moved with calm precision, his motions deliberate and economical, a man who had mastered both the machine and himself. What impressed the younger pilots most wasn't his fame, but his insight. He could coax extraordinary range out of a plane simply by the way he handled the throttle and mixture. While others burned through fuel aggressively, Lindbergh's technical mastery allowed him to stretch the limits of the aircraft's endurance. Fly the airplane like it wants to be flown, he'd tell them. And then he'd show them. Word spread quickly across the airbase. Lindbergh's lessons on engine management began saving lives. Fighter pilots who had once barely made it back from missions were now returning with fuel to spare. It wasn't theory, it was survival. He joined more sorties, sometimes against official orders. Pilots later recalled watching him dive through cloud banks and come out firing, a civilian consultant fighting alongside them in the thick of war. One mission stood out. In July 1944, Lindbergh flew with the 475th Fighter Group on a raid over the enemy-held island of Ceram. The formation encountered Japanese Zero fighters. Despite being unauthorized to engage, Lindbergh found himself in the middle of a dogfight. When a Zero latched onto the tail of a P-38, Lindbergh reacted instinctively. Pulling his Lightning into a steep climb, he swung behind the attacker, fired, and watched the enemy plane spiral into the sea below. He had just shot down a Japanese fighter, as a civilian. After landing, no one said much. The silence wasn't disapproval. It was awe. The man who had once symbolized peace through aviation had now joined them in war and had proven he could still fight. Lindbergh recorded his experiences meticulously in his journal. His entries reveal a complex mix of technical observation and moral reflection. "War is a strange contradiction," he wrote. "We destroy in order to preserve." He noted the smell of the jungle at dawn, the metallic taste of engine fumes, and the eerie stillness that followed a mission when adrenaline faded and reality crept back in. He was fascinated by the blend of man and machine, how instinct and technology merged in the cockpit. Each flight tested not only the limits of the P-38, but also the endurance of the human spirit. In a letter home, he wrote, "The men here are magnificent. They live simply, die suddenly, and in between, they laugh." Those around him began to see Lindbergh less as the aloof celebrity and more as one of their own, quiet, meticulous, driven, and utterly fearless. By late summer, Lindbergh's unofficial combat record had grown. He flew over 50 missions, ranging from escort runs to ground attacks. His mechanical insights alone would have justified his trip, but his presence carried a deeper weight. For many pilots, it was a reminder of what aviation could mean beyond war, the purity of flight itself. Still, his actions weren't without consequence. Back in Washington, word of his combat participation reached military command. Technically, a civilian engaging in combat violated international law and military regulations. His superiors at United Aircraft quietly advised him to stop flying missions immediately. Lindbergh complied reluctantly, but he left behind an indelible impression and invaluable data that would later influence engine management practices across the Pacific. Before departing New Guinea, Lindbergh took one final flight. As he soared above the green sprawl of the island, he reflected on how far he'd come, from the calm solitude of the Spirit of St. Louis to the violent skies of the Pacific. The contrast was sharp, almost haunting. He landed, shut down the engines, and climbed out of the cockpit. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening to the slow ticking of the cooling metal. He had once crossed an ocean to prove what was possible. Now he had crossed into something far deeper, the moral turbulence of war. In the years that followed, Lindbergh rarely spoke about his time in New Guinea. Official histories of the Pacific Air War make only passing reference to his presence. Yet for those who flew with him, the memory remained vivid. The sight of the world's most famous aviator, calm and precise, guiding them through enemy skies. Colonel MacDonald later wrote that Lindbergh had no need to prove anything, yet he proved everything. His contribution wasn't just technical, it was symbolic. In those brief weeks, Lindbergh bridged two eras, the romantic age of early flight and the mechanized brutality of modern war. When he left, the pilots felt a strange emptiness. The jungle, once alive with the thunder of P-38s, seemed quieter. The legend had come and gone, leaving behind not a myth, but a man. Flawed, brilliant, and profoundly human. Years later, historians would debate the meaning of Lindbergh's actions in New Guinea. Some saw them as redemption, a way to reclaim his honor after the political controversies that had shadowed him before the war. Others viewed them as the inevitable restlessness of a man who could never stop testing limits. Whatever the motive, one truth remained. When Lindbergh climbed into that P-38, he wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing understanding of machines, of men, and of himself. And somewhere over the Pacific, amidst the roar of engines and the flash of tracer fire, he found it. If only for a moment. That moment, when Charles Lindbergh, the man who had once flown alone across the Atlantic, found himself once again alone in the sky, marked a quiet reconciliation between who he was and what the world had become. For the men of Hollandia Air Base, it was a story they would tell for decades, how the world's most famous pilot came to the jungle, taught them to fly farther, fought beside them, and then disappeared as quietly as he had arrived. And for Lindbergh, it was one last flight into history, not as a symbol or a hero, but as a man still searching for purpose in the endless sky. When Lindbergh left Hollandia Air Base, the war was far from over. The Pacific still burned with the fury of two empires locked in total struggle. But for those who had flown beside him, something had changed. His lessons, simple yet profound, remained etched into their routines. He had shown them that flight was more than aggression or defense. It was an art of endurance, of understanding the machine beneath you. Even in war, mastery could be graceful. Lindbergh returned quietly to the United States later that year. No parades greeted him. No newspaper headlines celebrated his combat role. In fact, the public barely knew it had happened. His wartime service existed in the shadows, like an unspoken truth. Officially, he was a consultant who had helped improve engine efficiency in tropical conditions. Unofficially, he was a combat veteran who had risked his life dozens of times in enemy skies. It was a paradox that fit the man himself, both hero and exile, pioneer and skeptic, idealist and realist. In 1945, as the war reached its brutal conclusion, Lindbergh was invited to witness what his country had achieved. He visited the bombed-out remains of German cities, stood beside captured V-2 rockets, and observed firsthand how technology had evolved from his early dreams into something monstrous. The same principles of flight that had once united mankind in wonder had now given birth to machines that could annihilate entire cities. He wrote in his journal, "Science and war have become partners, and together they have made a monster." This was the burden of progress, the realization that the age of innocence in aviation had died in the fires of war. After the surrender of Japan, Lindbergh was asked to evaluate post-war aircraft technology for the Navy. He traveled through devastated Japan, inspecting airfields littered with the wreckage of once-proud Zero fighters. In Tokyo, he saw firsthand the ruins of a nation that had once rivaled the might of the United States in the skies. For a man who had always been captivated by precision engineering, the sight was haunting. "These planes," he noted, "are the skeletal remains of ideas, brilliant, deadly, and now obsolete." He had seen aviation evolve from fabric-covered wings to high-speed, all-metal machines, and yet, despite their perfection, they were now relics of a war that had cost millions of lives. When he returned home, America had changed too. The pilot who once symbolized the nation's pioneering spirit found himself in a country that had outgrown him. New heroes had taken flight. The bomber crews of Europe, the carrier pilots of the Pacific, the astronauts in waiting who would soon look beyond Earth itself. Lindbergh's quiet, introspective nature no longer fit the image of post-war America. He withdrew from public life, choosing instead to write, reflect, and disappear into the solitude he had always sought. In his later writings, he spoke often of balance between man and nature, between progress and restraint. He had seen what unrestrained ambition could create, a sky filled with fire. When he returned home, America had changed too. The pilot who once symbolized the nation's pioneering spirit found himself in a country that had outgrown him. New heroes had taken flight. The bomber crews of Europe, the carrier pilots of the Pacific, the astronauts in waiting who would soon look beyond Earth itself. Lindbergh's quiet, introspective nature no longer fit the image of post-war America. He withdrew from public life, choosing instead to write, reflect, and disappear into the solitude he had always sought. In his later writings, he spoke often of balance between man and nature, between progress and restraint. He had seen what unrestrained ambition could create, a sky filled with fire. Yet for all his introspection, Lindbergh never lost his fascination with flight. He remained a test pilot in spirit, continuing to fly experimental aircraft into his later years. He consulted for both military and civilian companies, yet his technical expertise still unmatched. Pilots who met him described a man of quiet brilliance, courteous, intense, and endlessly curious. He had little interest in fame. To him, the true reward of flight was not recognition, but revelation. By the 1950s, Lindbergh had become something of a ghost in American consciousness. The world had moved on, from propellers to jets, from Atlantic crossings to space exploration. But among those who knew aviation's lineage, his influence was everywhere. His wartime lessons on range and fuel management had shaped both combat tactics and long-distance flight operations. His journals, filled with meticulous detail, later became invaluable to engineers and historians alike. Still, the question lingered. What had driven him into combat as a civilian, against orders, in the jungles of New Guinea? Perhaps it was guilt for the words he had spoken before the war, for the neutrality he had once defended. Perhaps it was instinct, the call of the sky, the need to test himself again. Or perhaps it was something simpler, a man's need to understand his craft in the most complete, dangerous way possible. Whatever the reason, those weeks in 1944 revealed more about Lindbergh than any headline ever had. In 1953, Lindbergh published The Spirit of St. Louis, his own account of that first great flight across the Atlantic. The book won the Pulitzer Prize. Readers expected tales of adventure, but what they found was something deeper, the portrait of a man who viewed flight as both science and philosophy. It wasn't about glory, it was about clarity, about confronting the unknown and coming back changed. And in that way, the story of Hollandia, his wartime journey, was an echo of the same theme, another test of courage, another crossing into uncertainty. In the decades that followed, Lindbergh became increasingly private. He traveled extensively through the Pacific once more, this time not as a combatant, but as an observer and conservationist. He advocated for environmental protection long before it became a global concern. He saw the fragility of the world from above, the vast emptiness of the ocean, the thin line of atmosphere that separated life from nothingness. His later writings reflected that shift. The human race has grown too powerful without growing wise. It was a sobering realization. The same man who had once embodied technological triumph now warned against its excess. When he died in 1974 at his home in Hawaii, Lindbergh left behind not just a legacy, but a paradox. He was the boy who had conquered the Atlantic, the man who had flirted with politics and been scarred by it, the pilot who had fought in a war he was never supposed to join, and the elder who had looked down on the earth and seen both its beauty and its fragility. In every chapter, flight had been his constant, not merely as a means of movement, but as a metaphor for existence itself. For historians, his time in New Guinea remains one of the most fascinating, least understood episodes of his life. There are few photographs, few official records, only fragments of recollection, and his own handwritten notes. But those who were there never forgot. They remembered the lean, quiet man who spoke little and observed much, who treated every flight as an experiment, and who faced danger with almost meditative calm. One pilot later said, "He flew like a man listening to the airplane breathe." That was Lindbergh, precise, detached, and utterly in tune with the machine. His legacy in World War II is often overshadowed by his earlier fame, but in truth, it may be the more revealing story. The Atlantic crossing had proven what man could achieve. The New Guinea missions showed what he could endure. In those skies, amid the thunder of engines and the haze of jungle heat, Lindbergh confronted the ultimate paradox of progress, that the same ingenuity that lifts us higher also brings us closer to destruction. It was a lesson that haunted him for the rest of his life. Today, few remember that Charles Lindbergh once flew combat missions in the Pacific. His name is more often linked with peace, controversy, and exploration. Yet that hidden chapter, those brief, dangerous weeks in 1944, offers perhaps the truest glimpse of who he really was. A man of contradictions, a man of courage, a man who sought meaning in the sky. If one stands today at the site of the old Hollandia airbase, little remains. The jungle has reclaimed the runways. The huts and hangars are gone, their outlines blurred by vines and rain. But somewhere beneath that overgrowth lies the memory of a time when the world's most famous pilot walked those same grounds, waiting for dawn, preparing for flight. You can almost hear it. The distant growl of engines warming up, the rhythmic slap of propellers cutting humid air, and above it all, the quiet voice of a man saying, "Fly the airplane like it wants to be flown." And then the takeoff. The P-38 lifting gracefully from the earth, climbing into the sky, vanishing into cloud and legend. For Charles Lindbergh, the skies of New Guinea were more than a battlefield. They were a crucible, a place where he rediscovered both the power and peril of human flight. In that sense, his journey was not about war at all. It was about reconciliation between man and machine, between past and present, between genius and humility. He had once been a symbol of perfection. In New Guinea, he became something far more profound. A reminder that even the greatest among us are shaped, tested, and redeemed by the storms they fly through.